Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
This happened about 7 years ago, and even now I still live in the same building where it happened. Nothing else that's strange has happened to me there since, which is probably one of the reasons I still think about that night. It was around 4 in the morning. I had been out somewhere and had just driven back home. I was completely sober. I had not been drinking. I was not under the influence of anything, and as far as I remember, I was simply tired in the normal way anyone would be at that hour. Our building has an underground garage. I had used it countless times before. I knew the layout. I knew where the lights were. I knew which parking spaces belonged to which apartments. I also knew most of the people who lived in the building. Even back then, I was familiar enough with the neighbors that seeing an unfamiliar person inside the garage would immediately stand out. Normally, the garage at that hour was completely uneventful. You drive in, park, turn off the engine, get out, lock the car, walk toward the entrance to the building. That is exactly what I expected to do that night. I parked in my usual place and turned the engine off. Once the car went quiet, the garage had that familiar underground silence. Concrete walls make every small sound seem sharper. A car door closing echoes. Keys sound louder. Footsteps carry. Even ventilation systems can sound strange when there is no other activity. I got out of the car. Then I saw him. There was a man standing in the middle of the garage. He was not walking through. He was not getting into a car. He was not carrying groceries. He did not seem to be searching for anything. He was just standing there, and he was looking directly at me. I stopped for a second. I had never seen him before. That was my first thought. Who is this guy? The second thing I noticed was that he was smoking. There was a cigarette in his hand, and he seemed completely relaxed about standing there at 4 in the morning in someone else's underground garage. What frightened me was not really the cigarette. It was his face. More specifically, his eyes. There was something about the way they caught the light. I remember thinking there was a spark in them. I do not mean literal flames or anything supernatural. It was probably a reflection from the garage lighting or the cigarette. But in that moment, his eyes looked incredibly sharp. Alive, focused, he was staring at me in a way that made my entire body react. I did not know whether he was angry, high, drunk, waiting for someone, planning something, or simply wondering who I was. But the look made me feel immediately unsafe. There are times when you can explain exactly why someone scares you. They are shouting, they have a weapon, they are approaching quickly. This man was doing none of those things. He was only standing there and staring. And somehow, that felt worse. Maybe because there was no obvious reason for him to be there. An underground residential garage at 4 in the morning is not a place where people normally stand around casually, especially someone you have never seen in the building before. I remember feeling that if I stayed there trying to figure out who he was, I might regret it. So I did not ask him anything. I did not say hello. I did not challenge him. I did not walk closer. I just moved toward the building entrance as quickly as I could. I wanted a locked door between us. I was very aware of the sound of my own footsteps. I was also waiting to hear his. That was probably the worst part of the walk toward the entrance. I kept expecting another set of footsteps behind me. Fast ones. Or a voice. Anything. I do not remember him saying a word. As far as I know, he stayed where he was. But I did not turn around long enough to check. I rushed inside the building. Once the door closed behind me, I felt much safer. I remember standing there for a moment and thinking about whether I should look back through the door. Part of me wanted to see if he was still there. Another part of me wanted nothing to do with him. I chose the second option. I went upstairs. That was basically the entire event. No chase. No attack. No knock on my apartment door later. No mysterious disappearance that I actually witnessed. Just a strange man standing in our underground garage at 4 in the morning, smoking and staring at me. That sounds almost too simple to be frightening. But if you have ever entered a place where you are certain you should be alone and suddenly realized someone is already there watching you, you probably understand. The timing mattered. The location mattered. At 4 in the afternoon, seeing an unfamiliar man in the garage would not have affected me nearly as much. Maybe he was visiting someone. Maybe he was a delivery person. Maybe he was working nearby. At 4 in the morning, every one of those explanations becomes less obvious. The garage was also enclosed. If something happened, there were fewer people around to hear it. The building was asleep. The street outside was probably mostly empty. That makes the presence of a stranger feel more threatening, even if the stranger has no bad intentions. I still live in the same building today. I know the neighbors. I knew most of them back then, too. And I never identified the man. Nobody later introduced him. I never saw him walking around the building. I never saw him use one of the parking spaces. As far as I can remember, I never saw him again. That is probably why the incident never received an ordinary ending. If I had seen him the following week and discovered he was someone's brother, I would have forgotten about the whole thing. If a neighbor had said, "Oh, that was my friend. He was waiting for me downstairs." Mystery solved. But that never happened. So in my memory, he remains exactly where I first saw him, standing alone in the middle of the underground garage, smoking, watching me. There are obviously normal explanations. The simplest is that he was visiting someone in the building. People do not always know every visitor their neighbors have. Even if I knew every resident, I could not know all of their friends, relatives, partners, coworkers, or guests. Maybe someone let him into the garage. Maybe he came down to smoke because smoking inside an apartment was not allowed. That would actually make a lot of sense. If he was staying with someone, he might have gone downstairs for a cigarette so he would not disturb them. Then I drove in. From his point of view, maybe I was the stranger. A car arrives at 4 in the morning. Someone gets out. He looks at me. I interpret his stare as threatening because I do not recognize him. He may simply have been trying to figure out whether I live there. That is completely possible. The cigarette strengthens that explanation. People sometimes step outside or into garages to smoke late at night. An underground garage is not necessarily the safest place to do it, but people choose convenient places. Maybe he was simply standing there because he wanted to finish the cigarette before going back upstairs. The strange part is how he got in. But residential garages are not impossible to access. Someone follows a car through the entrance. A resident leaves the door open. A visitor has a remote. Someone is let in. The fact that I did not know him does not mean he had no legitimate reason to be there. Another possibility is that he was waiting for someone. Maybe a resident was supposed to pick him up. Maybe he was a taxi driver or a friend who had somehow entered the garage. Maybe he had been dropped off and was waiting for a door to open. Again, strange at 4 in the morning. Not impossible. He could also have been trespassing. That possibility is less comfortable. Someone may have entered the garage because it was warmer than outside, or because they wanted somewhere private to smoke. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe intoxicated. Maybe looking for unlocked cars. Maybe trying to find a place to sleep. I have no evidence for any of those things. He never approached my car. He never touched anything that I saw. But an unauthorized person inside the garage would explain why I never saw him again. And if that was the situation, getting inside quickly was probably the right decision. The way his eyes looked also probably has an ordinary explanation. A dark garage with artificial lighting creates strong reflections. Human eyes are wet, curved surfaces. They catch small points of light. A cigarette ember can create another bright source. If the rest of his face was partly shadowed while his eyes reflected light, they could appear unusually bright or sharp. Fear would amplify that. The moment my brain decided, unknown man. 4 in the morning. Garage. I was already evaluating him as a potential threat. His expression would look harsher, his eyes more intense, his stillness more deliberate. That does not mean I imagined the man. I absolutely believe a man was there. The uncertainty is what his expression actually meant. A neutral stare can feel hostile if the context is wrong. Imagine seeing someone stare at you in a crowded cafe. Maybe awkward. Now, put the same expression on a stranger in an underground garage at 4 in the morning. Completely different feeling. The environment changes the meaning. I also could have been tired. I was awake at 4 in the morning, so even though I was sober, I may not have been at my sharpest. Fatigue affects perception and emotion. A tired brain can be more easily startled. Shadows look stronger. Ambiguous expressions become harder to read. Reaction times change. That might explain why the spark in his eyes became such a strong detail in memory. But I do not think tiredness explains away the entire event. There really was a stranger there. Being cautious around an unknown person in an enclosed space at that hour was reasonable. Sometimes people hear a story like this and try too hard to prove the stranger was harmless. Maybe he was, but I had no way to know. I think leaving was the correct choice, regardless. There is a difference between paranoia and caution. If a stranger makes you uncomfortable in an isolated garage, you do not owe them the benefit of standing around until you understand their intentions. You can leave. That is what I did. What makes the story strange is not that I sensed a ghost. I did not. I saw a man, a physical person, as far as I could tell. What I cannot explain is who he was or why he was standing there. But unexplained does not mean impossible. Buildings contain visitors. Garages get trespassers. People smoke at bizarre hours. People wait for others. Sometimes you see someone once and never again. All of those things happen. The event only becomes supernatural if I add something that did not actually occur. If I said he vanished while I watched him, that would be different. If security footage showed an empty garage while I clearly interacted with him, different. If he appeared inside locked areas repeatedly, different. None of that happened. I saw him. I got scared. I went inside. I never found out who he was. That is the entire mystery. And in some ways, I think that is why it stayed unsettling. There was no conclusion. Human danger is often scarier than paranormal danger because you know the possibilities are real. Maybe he was completely harmless. Maybe he was waiting for a friend. But there is also a chance he was not supposed to be there. A chance he had been watching cars. A chance he was looking for someone. A chance his reason for staring at me was not innocent. I will never know. That uncertainty is enough. The fact that I still live there makes the memory stranger, too. I have parked in the same garage hundreds, probably thousands of times since then. Every time I arrive late at night, part of me still looks through the space before getting out of the car. It is automatic now. Check the corners. Look between vehicles. Make sure nobody is standing in the middle. Usually there is nobody. The garage is just a garage. Concrete, cars, pipes, lights, nothing remotely creepy. That normality almost makes the original night harder to understand. Where had he come from? If he lived nearby, why did I never see him again? If he was someone's visitor, whose? If he was trespassing, how did he get in? And why was he just standing there? Maybe he had heard my car arrive and turned to watch. That would explain the stare. If you were standing somewhere you probably should not be, and a resident drives in, you might freeze. Maybe he was wondering if I would confront him. Maybe he was more nervous about me than I was about him. That possibility never occurred to me that night. I only knew I did not like the way he was looking at me. There is also the possibility that he was smoking near some exit or ventilation point and only appeared to be standing in the middle because of the angle from my parking space. Memory simplifies space over time. Maybe he was closer to a wall, maybe near another car. Maybe he had been walking and stopped when I looked. 7 years is long enough for those details to become less reliable. I remember the emotional image more strongly than the exact geometry. Man, middle of garage, cigarette, eyes, that is what remains. Exact distance, not sure. Exact clothing, I do not remember. Age, not clearly. Hair, I could not confidently tell you. That tells me something important. My memory preserved the features associated with threat, not a complete description. That is normal. If I had needed to identify him the next day, I might have struggled more than I would like to admit. That also means I cannot be completely certain I never saw him again. Maybe I passed him later in daylight and simply did not recognize him. At 4 in the morning under garage lighting, someone looks different. The same person wearing normal clothes in sunlight could seem completely unfamiliar. Maybe he really was a neighbor's visitor I saw again several times without connecting the faces. That would make the mystery even more ordinary. The cigarette smell or smoke may also have made the scene visually stranger. Smoke in artificial lighting can create halos and reflections. If smoke drifted near his face, small bright areas could appear and disappear. His eyes might have caught light through that haze. The ember itself could reflect from his glasses if he wore any, though I do not remember glasses. All those little visual effects can produce the spark I remember. And once fear attaches importance to a detail, it becomes stronger each time the memory is replayed. I am careful not to turn that spark into something supernatural. His eyes were not glowing. That is not what I mean. They looked unsettling. That is different. Sometimes people simply look frightening in a particular moment. Lighting, expression, context, your own nervous system, all of it combines. I think my reaction was partly instinctive because I had expected the garage to be empty. Unexpected human presence is powerful. If you walk into your kitchen and find your roommate standing there, no problem. If you walk into the same kitchen believing you are home alone and find a silent stranger standing there, your body reacts before your mind knows what to do. The person has not changed. Your expectation has. That is what happened in the garage. I had mentally classified the environment as private and safe. My building, my parking space, 4 in the morning. Then suddenly there was another person inside that space. Unknown, watching, That violation of expectation probably created most of the fear. I also think being underground contributed. Garages feel enclosed. There is no simple open path in every direction. Cars block sight lines. Concrete amplifies sounds. Fluorescent lighting creates deep shadow between vehicles. If someone starts following you, your options feel limited. Even a completely ordinary person can look threatening in that setting. That does not mean I overreacted. It means the environment was giving my brain legitimate reasons to be cautious. What I sometimes wonder is whether he watched me go. I never turned around properly. Did he keep standing there? Did he leave through another entrance? Did he get into a car? Did someone come down and meet him? Those answers were probably available only minutes later. But I did not stay to find out. And I am glad I did not. Solving a mystery is not worth testing a stranger's intentions at 4 in the morning. If it happened now, I would probably do almost exactly the same thing. Stay near the car if necessary. Keep distance. Go toward the locked building entrance. Maybe contact security or someone inside if the situation seemed wrong. But I would not walk up and ask, "Who are you?" That is the kind of thing that sounds brave in hindsight and foolish in real life. Sometimes the safest ending to a creepy story is the anticlimactic one. You leave. Nothing happens. Years later, you still do not know. There is another thing about the memory I have thought about. I say I knew all my neighbors. That was true enough. But apartment buildings have more human traffic than residents realize. Partners, children's friends, family members, cleaners, repair workers, delivery drivers, previous tenants, property managers, people borrowing cars, people visiting from out of town. One unknown face is not statistically shocking. What made it shocking was the hour. If I saw him at noon, I might not even remember him. 4 in the morning transformed an ordinary unknown visitor into something suspicious. That timing may be the whole story. Maybe he had just arrived from a late flight. Maybe he worked nights. Maybe he was leaving an apartment after a party. Maybe his sleeping host did not allow smoking inside and he came downstairs. Those possibilities are boring. They are also plausible. The fact that he was smoking actually makes the guest who went downstairs for a cigarette explanation one of my favorites. He may have deliberately chosen the garage because it was warmer or more private than standing outside. Then my car came in and surprised him. We stared at each other. I thought he looked terrifying. He may have thought I looked suspicious, too. Then, I hurried away. For him, it may not even be a memorable event. That thought makes me laugh slightly now. Somewhere there could be a man who vaguely remembers, years ago I was smoking in my friend's garage and some resident saw me and basically ran away. He might have no idea I have remembered him for 7 years. Or maybe that is not what happened. Maybe he was trespassing. The building might have had a temporary security problem. He could have followed another car inside. He could have found an unlocked door. If he was checking parked vehicles, my arrival might have interrupted him. He stood still because he wanted to see what I would do. Then, once I entered the building, he left. That explanation is darker, but still completely human. There is no evidence for it, though. Nothing was stolen from my car. I do not remember hearing about break-ins. So I cannot turn him into a criminal just because he scared me. His presence was suspicious to me. That is all. I also never heard that anyone else had seen him. If multiple residents had reported the same unknown man standing in the garage every night, that would be a different story. As far as I know, it happened once. A single encounter. That strongly suggests an ordinary temporary visitor or trespasser. The most unsettling experiences are not always the ones with impossible details. Sometimes there is nothing impossible at all. A stranger can be completely real and still leave you with no explanation. I think that is what happened to me. I did not see an apparition. I did not hallucinate some monster. I saw a man whose reason for being there was unknown to me. My fear filled in the possibilities. And because I never learned which possibility was true, they all remained. Harmless visitor, drunk stranger, someone waiting, someone hiding, someone looking for a car, someone who simply wanted a cigarette. Every explanation fits part of the scene. None can be confirmed. So all these years later, I still remember it exactly as a question. Who was he? Even now, if I come home very late and drive into that garage, I sometimes think about him. The gate closes behind the car. The engine echoes against the concrete. I pull into my space. Before I turn the car off, I look around. Most nights there is nothing there except parked vehicles and empty floor. Then I get out and go inside. Completely normal. But every once in a while, especially when it is very late, I remember that one night 7 years ago. 4 in the morning. Car door opens. I step out. And instead of an empty garage, there is a man I have never seen before, standing in the middle of it. Not walking, not talking, just smoking, watching me. The light catches his eyes in a way that makes them look almost sharp. I feel fear before I can explain why. I rush for the building. And that is where the story ends. He never followed me. He never appeared again. Nothing happened. Which should make the whole experience easier to forget. But somehow, it does not. Because sometimes the fact that nothing happened only means you will never find out what might have. Years ago, probably around 1998, when I was learning shiatsu massage. At the time, I would sometimes practice at home on my dad. Nothing professional or dramatic. I was still learning, and he was willing to let me practice the technique, so every now and then we would clear some space in the lounge room, and I would work on him on the floor. That was what we had been doing that day. The room was completely familiar to me. Same couch, same furniture, same lighting. Nothing unusual had happened during the massage. There had been no strange noises, no feeling of being watched, no creepy atmosphere. When I finished, Dad started getting up from the floor, and that was when I noticed something sitting on the couch. At first, I did not know what I was looking at. It had the general size of a child, maybe around 10 years old. But it did not look like an actual child. There were no facial features, no recognizable clothes, no hair, no eyes, nothing that would let me identify it as a person. The closest comparison I can make is the simple male symbol you see on public toilet signs. Just the basic shape of a human being. Head, body, arms, legs, except this thing was three-dimensional and almost completely transparent. If you have ever used something like Photoshop and adjusted the opacity of an image until it is barely visible, that is roughly what it looked like. Maybe 5% visible. 95% transparent. I could see the room through it. The couch behind it was still visible, but there was definitely an outline there. Something had enough contrast that my eyes registered the shape of a seated person. The figure seemed to be sitting naturally on the couch, not floating above it, not standing beside it. Sitting, and it did not move. I remember looking at it and thinking that it was unusual rather than frightening. That may be one of the strangest parts of the whole experience. If someone described a transparent, child-sized human figure appearing on their couch, you would expect screaming. I did not scream. I was not even particularly scared. I was mostly curious. Dad was getting up, so I asked him if he could see it too. I was expecting him to say, "See? What?" Instead, he looked toward the couch, and he said yes. He could see it. That changed the experience immediately. Until that moment, I could have assumed something was wrong with my eyes. Maybe I had been staring at one spot too long. Maybe the massage had tired me. Maybe I was seeing an afterimage. But Dad was looking at the same area and apparently seeing the same thing. He did not seem frightened either, more puzzled than anything. We both stood there looking at this faint human-shaped form sitting on the couch. Dad eventually went to get Mum. She had been in the bedroom. He brought her out and pointed toward the couch. She looked, then looked again. She could not see anything. That made her nervous. I think the fact that Dad and I were both calmly insisting there was something sitting there probably bothered her more than if only one of us had said it. From her perspective, the couch was empty. From ours, there was a person-shaped, transparent form sitting on it. She did not like that at all. Dad and I still were not especially scared. I think curiosity had taken over. I moved closer. Then I sat down beside it. That is another part people have trouble understanding when I tell the story. Why would I sit beside something I thought might be a ghost? The simple answer is that it did not feel threatening. It had not moved toward us. It had not made a sound. There was no face staring back. It was just there. Different, unexplained, but not aggressive. So I wanted to see whether it still looked the same from another angle. It did. From beside it, the figure still seemed to occupy three-dimensional space. That was what really interested me. If it had been some stain or strange patch of light on the wall, moving sideways should have changed it completely. If it were a reflection on a flat surface, the relationship between the shape and the couch should have shifted in an obvious way. Instead, it seemed like there was a faint volume there, a seated shape. I could look at it from the side. It still looked like something sitting beside me, but it did not respond. No head turning, no movement, no reaction when I sat down. Nothing. Eventually, Dad went into the bedroom with Mum to watch television. I remained around the lounge room. Every now and then I looked back at the couch, still there. This was not something that appeared for half a second and vanished before I could understand it. It stayed. That is important to me. A lot of strange visual experiences are incredibly brief. You see a shape. Turn your head. Gone, this was different. I had time to examine it, time to ask Dad, time for him to get Mum, time to move around it, time to sit beside it, time for Dad and Mum to go back into the bedroom. The figure remained. I would estimate it was there for around half an hour. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I was not timing it. Eventually, I got up to check again. At some point, it was simply gone. I do not remember watching it fade away. I did not see it stand. There was no dramatic disappearance. One time I looked, and it was there. Later I checked, and it was not. That was it. Nothing else happened. I have told people the story since then, and a lot of them find it difficult to believe. I understand that. I find it difficult to believe, too. If someone told me today that they and another person saw a transparent child-shaped figure sitting on a couch for half an hour, I would immediately start looking for ordinary explanations. Lighting, reflection, eye strain, pattern recognition. Something in the room creating the outline. That is exactly what I do with my own memory. The fact that Dad saw it too is the part that makes it harder. But even shared perception does not automatically prove something supernatural. Two people in the same room are looking at the same environment. If there is an ambiguous pattern, both people can interpret it similarly. That is one possible explanation. Maybe there was something on or behind the couch, creating a faint human-shaped form, a reflection from a window, light passing through curtains, a shadow cast through some object, a combination of cushions and background shapes. I noticed it first. Then I asked Dad if he could see it. That matters. I did not ask him to independently describe what he saw without giving him any clue. I directed his attention toward the couch. Once someone says there is a person-like shape somewhere, the other person's brain immediately starts searching for that pattern. Humans are very good at finding people in incomplete images. Two circles and a line become a face. A coat hanging over a chair becomes a person. Shadows become bodies. Clouds become animals. This is called pareidolia in a broad sense, and it is completely normal. Maybe I saw an ambiguous patch of light. I identified it as a seated figure. Then Dad looked at the same patch with that idea already supplied. He saw the figure too. Mum did not. That could actually fit perfectly. Maybe Mum's viewing angle was different. Maybe her eyesight differed. Maybe she simply did not accept the pattern our brains had locked onto. The fact that one person could not see it is useful. If there had been a clearly visible physical shape in the room, you would expect all three people to see something. Unless the visual effect depended strongly on position. And position may have mattered. Reflections can be extremely angle dependent. A faint reflection from glass or polished furniture can exist from one part of a room and disappear from another. If Dad and I were standing near roughly the same area, while Mum approached from a different direction, that could explain why we saw something she did not. But I remember moving around the figure. I sat beside it. It still looked three-dimensional. That makes a simple fixed reflection harder to imagine. Not impossible, just harder. Maybe the source was not a reflection on the couch itself. Maybe light was scattered in the air. Smoke, dust, a thin curtain. Something transparent positioned near the couch. If there were multiple overlapping visual elements, moving around could preserve a vague human-like volume. The room may also have had strong contrast. If we had been focusing closely during the shiatsu practice, then looked up suddenly, our visual systems might have been adapting. Afterimages can produce faint shapes. Normally, an afterimage matches whatever you stared at previously. But if Dad's body position during the massage had created a rough human form in my vision, perhaps some residual image remained when I looked toward the couch. The problem is Dad saw it too. He would need to have a similar afterimage. That is possible if we had both been focusing on similar high-contrast shapes or lighting, but it becomes more complicated. And an afterimage should generally move with the eyes rather than remain anchored convincingly to one couch position. If I changed viewing angle and the figures still appeared to sit in the same place, that argues against a basic retinal afterimage. The duration also argues against it. Half an hour is far too long for a normal afterimage to remain unchanged, so I do not think that alone explains it. Another possibility is that there really was a faint physical object on the couch, something almost transparent, a sheet of thin material, a curtain, a mosquito net, clear plastic, some fabric. If it had been draped over cushions in the right way, the folds could create a human outline. From a distance, the object becomes a seated figure. Up close, because it is transparent, it still appears almost ghost-like. But I remember no actual material being there afterward. And if I sat beside it, I would think I would notice cloth or plastic. Still, memory from 1998 is not forensic evidence. There could have been something completely ordinary in that room that I no longer remember. The shape being roughly the size of a 10-year-old is also subjective. I did not measure it. It may have been smaller or larger. The toilet sign comparison is probably my brain's way of saying it lacked detail. That matters. I did not see a transparent face. I did not see clothing. I did not see fingers. I did not see eyes tracking me. I saw a simplified human form. That is exactly the kind of shape the brain is good at constructing from minimal information. If I had clearly seen a detailed child, that would be much harder to explain. Instead, it was almost symbolic. Head shape, body, limbs, no identity. That may point toward perception rather than an actual person like entity. The transparency also suggests low contrast. Maybe the object was only slightly different from the background. When contrast is low, the brain has to do more interpretive work. Once the outline becomes person, it can stay person for a long time. There is an interesting effect where ambiguous images become difficult to unsee once recognized. Look at random marks until you find a face. After that, the face keeps appearing every time you look. Dad and I may have locked onto the same ambiguous visual pattern. Mom never did. That could explain the entire experience. But there is still the three-dimensional quality. I remember deliberately moving because I wanted to test it. That tells me even then I was questioning whether it was a flat visual effect. From my new position, it still seemed to have volume. That is what keeps me from feeling completely satisfied with the pareidolia explanation. If the perception changed appropriately with perspective, then whatever generated it had some relationship to actual three-dimensional objects. But those objects could still have been ordinary. Couch cushions, a standing lamp, curtain folds, shadows from furniture, several separate shapes aligning into one figure from a range of positions. Rooms contain many overlapping edges. The brain can maintain a perceived object even when individual components change. It knows what it expects to see. Once it has decided a seated figure is there, it updates the shape as you move. That is basically what perception does constantly. We do not rebuild the world from scratch every time we move our head. The brain maintains object continuity. That can work against us with illusions. Dad's reaction is important too. He was not afraid. Neither was I. If we had both been seeing some threatening hallucination, you might expect panic. Instead, we treated it almost like an unusual visitor. That could mean there was no strong emotional priming. We were simply observing something ambiguous. Mum's nervousness may have come from being excluded from the perception. Two people saying, "There's something sitting there," and one person seeing nothing. That is inherently unsettling. I can imagine being in her position. You look at an empty couch while your husband and child calmly discuss a human-shaped figure occupying it. That might be creepier than seeing the thing yourself. There is also the possibility of suggestion working in the opposite direction. Maybe Dad did not see exactly what I saw. Maybe he saw something vague and agreed because he did not want to dismiss me. Parents sometimes do that. A child points at a cloud. "Do you see the dragon?" Dad says yes. He does see a shape, but maybe not the same shape with the same clarity. Over years, my memory could simplify that interaction into Dad saw exactly the same transparent person. I do not think he was lying. But agreement is not the same as independent, identical perception. Ideally, I would have asked him before describing anything, "What do you see on the couch?" Then had him describe size, position, posture, transparency, and shape without prompting. I did not. There was no reason to think scientifically in the moment. That limits how strong the shared witness detail really is. Still, he saw enough to go and get Mum. So something caught his attention. That is meaningful. Another possibility is an actual visual phenomenon caused by lighting from outside. Moving sunlight reflected from a car window. television light from another room, a window reflecting a pale object. If the light pattern fell across the couch and surrounding air in a particular way, it might create an apparent figure. But the half-hour duration again becomes difficult. Sunlight changes slowly. A reflected patch could remain for that long. But this happened indoors, and I do not remember whether it was daytime or evening strongly enough to reconstruct the light source. If it was late afternoon, changing sunlight could gradually alter the shape until it disappeared. That would explain why it eventually went away without movement. The source moved, the figure did not. Then the angle changed enough, and the illusion vanished. If it was nighttime, artificial lighting or reflections would be more likely. Again, the exact time of day is something I wish I remembered. People often ask why I did not take a photo. Today, of course, the first instinct would be to grab a phone. But this was around 1998. I did not have a smartphone. Nobody did. I did not have a digital camera sitting beside me. Taking a photograph would have meant finding a film camera, assuming one was loaded, taking the picture, then waiting to have the film developed. And even then, if the figure did not appear in the photograph, that would create a new mystery. Was it invisible to the camera? Or was it a visual illusion that existed only from a particular angle? If it did appear, that would have been incredibly useful. But photography simply did not occur to me. The experience was interesting, not an emergency. That is another reason I think people imagine the event differently when I tell it today. They imagine a modern paranormal encounter. Phone instantly comes out. Video, flash, zoom. In 1998, you could see something unusual and just look at it. That is what we did. And because it stayed for so long, maybe the lack of urgency made it feel even more ordinary. I sat beside it. Dad went to watch television. Mom did not want much to do with it. The figure stayed. Then disappeared at some point. There is no dramatic climax, no message, no movement, no connection to a death in the family, no strange history of the house that I know of. Nothing happened afterward that gave the figure an identity. That makes me less inclined to call it a ghost. What would I even mean by that? A dead 10-year-old? An entity? A projection? There is no evidence. It was a transparent, human-shaped visual phenomenon. That is the most honest description. Calling it a ghost adds a story we were never given. Maybe it was simply an optical illusion. Maybe Dad and I shared the same interpretation. Maybe something about the shiatsu session affected our visual attention. Shiatsu involves close physical focus, repetitive movement, pressure, posture, and sometimes a very relaxed state afterward. Perhaps both of us were visually or mentally relaxed enough to notice an ambiguous pattern we would normally ignore. I would not claim shiatsu caused hallucinations. There is no reason to. But the transition from focusing closely on the floor to standing and looking around may have influenced our vision. Changes in blood pressure when getting up, eye adaptation, fatigue, and attention could all affect perception briefly. Again, Dad had been lying down and then stood. Maybe his eyes were adjusting too. I had been working close to him and then changed focus. Two people experiencing similar visual adaptation could notice the same room featured differently. The half-hour duration still prevents that from being a complete explanation, but perhaps the initial visual effect caused us to notice an already existing ambiguous shape on the couch. Once noticed, it stayed perceptually stable until lighting changed. That would combine physiological and environmental factors. The fact that it never moved is actually one of the strongest clues toward an ordinary object or lighting pattern. Living things move. Even people sitting still breathe, shift weight, turn their heads. A ghost does not have to follow biological rules, of course, but that is exactly the problem, once you allow supernatural rules. Anything can fit. From an evidence standpoint, a motionless shape is more consistent with a static source. Furniture, light, reflection, fabric, shadow, the disappearance could simply mean conditions changed. I think that is probably the direction I would lean today. Some real visual pattern was present. I noticed it and interpreted it as a human shape. Dad could perceive the same pattern once directed toward it. Mum could not. We watched it until whatever lighting or alignment created it changed. Then it was gone. That explanation does not require either Dad or me to have imagined everything. We genuinely saw something. We may simply have been wrong about what the something represented. That distinction matters to me. People sometimes respond to stories like this with either "you saw a ghost" or "you saw nothing." There are many possibilities between those. Seeing something does not guarantee identifying it correctly. Our visual system is constantly interpreting incomplete information. Most of the time, it gets the world right. Occasionally, it creates a stable object from ambiguous input. And because Dad and I were exposed to the same scene, we could make the same mistake. I still find it strange. I still cannot recreate exactly what we saw. I have never looked at another couch and seen a transparent person sitting there for 30 minutes. If it were a common visual illusion, you might expect it to happen again. But rare combinations of lighting and geometry do happen once. A reflection that exists for half an hour on one afternoon in 1998 may never return. Maybe a car was parked outside at exactly the right angle. Maybe a curtain was sitting differently. Maybe something reflective had been placed somewhere temporarily. Without photographs of the room, I cannot test any of it. That is why the memory remains unresolved. What I do not think is useful is pretending certainty. I cannot say it was definitely a spirit. I also cannot say Dad and I definitely saw a reflection. I do not know. The strongest facts I remember are simple. There was a faint, human-shaped form sitting on the couch. It seemed roughly the size of a 10-year-old child. It had no features. It was almost entirely transparent. Dad could see it. Mum could not. I moved closer and viewed it from the side. It still seemed three-dimensional. It never moved. It remained for somewhere around half an hour. Then later, it was gone. That is enough. Even without a supernatural conclusion, it is one of the strangest visual experiences I have ever had. And I think the calmness is part of why I trust the memory. There was no panic forcing me to make instant decisions. I had time. I inspected it. I sat next to it. I checked again later. Fear did not end the observation. But calmness does not make perception infallible. A stable illusion can remain stable whether you are frightened or relaxed. That is why I leave it where it is. Unexplained, not proof, not nothing. Just something very unusual that Dad and I seem to share. People still ask why I did not photograph it. The answer is simple. It was 1998. A camera was not something I carried in my pocket. And at the time, there did not seem to be any urgency. Whatever it was had been sitting quietly on our couch for long enough that it almost started to feel like part of the room. Dad went off to watch television. Mum wanted nothing to do with it. I sat nearby and occasionally looked over. No movement, no sound, no threat, just the faint outline of a person who was mostly not there. Eventually, I checked the couch again. Empty, maybe changing light erased the illusion. Maybe Dad and I had spent half an hour looking at an accidental human shape made by furniture and reflection. That is probably more likely than anything paranormal. But I still remember sitting right beside it and looking across the space where its body seemed to be. I could see the couch through it. I could see the room through it. And yet there was enough of something there that both Dad and I could point to the exact same place and say that the couch was not empty. What it was, I still have no idea.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
Sometime in the 1980s, when I was a teenager growing up in Michigan. It was summer, and I had been at a friend's house that evening. Nothing unusual had happened. No drinking, no drugs, no fight, no reason I can remember for the night to stand out at all. Eventually, it was time to head home. I had my 10-speed bike with me, so I started riding back through the neighborhood. It was probably a couple of miles. At that age, a ride like that felt completely normal. I knew the area. I knew the streets. I had probably traveled some version of that route plenty of times before. The neighborhoods were quiet. It was late enough that most people were inside. The streets were dark, except for occasional porch lights and street lights. I remember the peaceful sound of the bike more than anything else. That quiet clicking the gears and chain made while I pedaled. The tires moving over the pavement, warm summer air, empty residential streets. It was one of those rides where you can almost stop thinking about the fact that you are riding. Your body handles the bike automatically. You just move. And then there is nothing. That is the part of the memory that has always bothered me. I do not remember losing control. I do not remember seeing a car. I do not remember hitting anything. I do not remember the front wheel striking the curb. I do not remember falling. One moment, as far as my memory is concerned, I was riding home. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the grass beside the road. My bike was near me. I was close to the curb, and my head hurt badly. At first, I did not understand what had happened. I remember trying to orient myself. Dark street, grass underneath me, bike nearby. I was still on my route home, or at least somewhere that made enough sense that I eventually knew where I was. My first thought was that I must have fallen. Maybe I had zoned out. Maybe, somehow, I had fallen asleep for a second while riding. That sounds ridiculous now, but when you wake up on the ground with no memory of getting there, your brain grabs whatever explanation seems possible. I may have drifted toward the curb. The wheel may have hit it. The bike stopped. I did not. Maybe my head hit the pavement or ground hard enough to knock me unconscious. That is the obvious explanation. But I do not remember the impact. There is simply a blank. I do not know how long I was lying there. It could have been seconds. It could have been several minutes, maybe longer. That uncertainty feels strange when I think about it now. There was no smartphone in my pocket, no GPS history, no text messages, no smartwatch, nothing that could tell me exactly when I left my friend's house or when I finally arrived home. It was the 80s. If nobody saw the crash, then there may have been no record of those missing minutes at all. Eventually, I managed to get myself home. That part of the memory is not especially clear either. I know I made it. I must have gotten the bike back somehow. Whether I rode it, walked it, or did some combination of both, I cannot say with confidence now. The headache was intense. By the next day, I was taken either to a doctor or to the emergency room. That part is fuzzy, too. I remember being evaluated. I remember being told I had a mild concussion. Then I spent roughly 2 days at home in bed. I was in pain. I was vomiting. I felt awful. So something physical definitely happened to me. This was not just a strange dream about falling off a bicycle. There was an injury. There were symptoms afterward. I lost time around the event. For most of my life, I never thought of the story as particularly mysterious. I assumed I had crashed. That was it. Teenager rides bike at night. Teenager hits curb. Teenager gets concussion. Not exactly supernatural. The missing memory made sense too. A concussion can disrupt memory around an accident. You may remember what happened before. You may remember waking afterward. The impact itself can simply be absent. So I never needed a stranger explanation. I had probably been tired. Maybe I stopped paying attention. Maybe there was something on the road I did not see. Maybe I hit a rough patch. Maybe the wheel clipped the curb at the wrong angle. There are countless ways to fall off a bicycle. And because I had a head injury, not remembering the actual crash was not surprising. What made the story strange happened much later. Recently, I brought it up with my family. I do not remember exactly how the subject came up. Maybe we were talking about childhood injuries, old stories, things we did as teenagers. Whatever the reason, I mentioned the bike accident. I expected the usual reaction. Someone saying, "Oh yeah, I remember that." Or, "You were so sick afterward." Or maybe one of my siblings laughing about how miserable I had looked lying in bed. Instead, nobody knew what I was talking about. Not one person. I have 5 siblings. Both of my parents were part of my childhood. That means there were 7 other people in my immediate family who could potentially remember something about the event. According to them, none did. No one remembered me coming home injured. No one remembered the doctor or emergency room visit. No one remembered me being diagnosed with a concussion. No one remembered me spending 2 days in bed vomiting. Nothing. It was as if the entire incident had never happened. That disturbed me much more than the original crash ever had. Because the memory is vivid to me. Not every detail. Some pieces are definitely fuzzy. But the central event feels completely real. Summer night. Bike ride, waking beside the curb. Grass, bike, massive headache. Medical visit. Concussion, bed, vomiting, those pieces have always existed in my memory as something that happened. So how could an entire family forget it? That is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The most obvious explanation is that they simply did forget. 7 people forgetting sounds impossible at first, but family memory is strange. An event can be huge to the person experiencing it and surprisingly minor to everyone else. For me, this was the night I woke up on the ground with no memory of crashing and spent 2 days sick afterward. For one sibling, maybe it was just he stayed in bed for a weekend. For another, maybe they were away. Maybe some were too young to understand what was happening. Maybe my parents were busy with 5 other children and dozens of other problems. A concussion that did not lead to hospitalization for weeks or permanent disability may have blended into all the other childhood accidents over the decades. What feels unforgettable to me may not have been unforgettable to them. There is another issue. When families remember the past, people often rely on each other. One person says, "I don't remember that." Another thinks for a moment and says, "Neither do I." Soon, everyone agrees, no one remembers. That is not the same as proving it never happened. If one person had suddenly said, "Wait, wasn't that the time you crashed near such and such street?" maybe others would have started remembering pieces. Instead, the first reaction may have set the tone. Nobody remembers. So the event feels erased. My parents' lack of memory is the hardest part for me. One of them presumably took me for medical attention. Someone looked after me while I was sick. You would think that would create a memory. But parents deal with a lot over decades. Children get fevers, broken bones, cuts, sports injuries, bike crashes, emergency room visits, stomach bugs. What becomes a defining memory for the child may become one medical event among many for the parent. And this was around 40 years ago. Memory can disappear. I've probably forgotten things my parents remember clearly too. So their lack of recollection is strange, but not impossible. There is also the possibility that some details in my own memory are wrong. That is harder to consider because the event feels so vivid. But vividness does not guarantee accuracy. Maybe the bike crash really happened, but the medical aftermath became mixed with another illness. Perhaps I crashed and had a headache. Then at some other point in childhood, I spent 2 days vomiting. Years later, those memories merged. Now I remember bike crash caused concussion, caused vomiting. Maybe only part of that sequence is correct. Or perhaps the medical visit happened after a different injury. Maybe I was told I had a concussion at another time. The brain can combine events that have similar themes. Injury, bed, parents worried. Doctor, sickness, decades later, separate memories can become one continuous story. That possibility could explain why my family does not recognize the exact version I tell. Maybe they remember pieces, but not combined in that way. There is also the possibility that I have the age or year wrong. I remember being a teenager in the 80s. But perhaps the event happened slightly earlier or later. Maybe some siblings had already moved out. Maybe a parent was away. Maybe the family circumstances were different from what I picture now. A mistaken timeline can make other people's lack of memory seem more mysterious than it is. If I ask, "Do you remember when I crashed my bike that summer?" they search the wrong year. Nothing. That does not mean the crash never happened. The strongest evidence in my own memory is the physical aftermath. The concussion, the headache, the vomiting. Those details feel difficult to invent from nothing. But the brain is capable of creating extremely convincing autobiographical memories, especially when they are built from real fragments. A story does not have to be completely fabricated to become inaccurate. Maybe 90% happened. Maybe the missing 10% changes the whole interpretation. One detail I find especially interesting is that I do not clearly remember whether I went to an emergency room or a doctor's office. That uncertainty seems normal for a real old memory. If this were some perfectly constructed false memory, you might expect every detail to feel equally certain. Instead, parts are missing. That is exactly what I would expect from an event involving a head injury 40 years ago. The ride is vivid. The grass is vivid. The headache is vivid. The medical location is blurry. That unevenness actually makes the memory feel more believable to me. At the same time, the concussion itself could explain why my own memory of the event is strange. Head injuries can interfere with how memories are formed around the time of the injury. I may have lost more than the moment of impact. Perhaps pieces before and after were never stored normally. My brain may have reconstructed the sequence later from what people told me. Imagine that I woke on the grass with no memory of crashing. Someone later told me, "You must have hit the curb." Over time, must have becomes part of the memory. Maybe my belief that I zoned out or fell asleep came later too. I do not actually know why I crashed. I only know that I ended up on the ground. That distinction matters. There are many possible causes. A pothole, a curb, an animal crossing, a car that came too close, a mechanical problem with the bike, a brief medical event, simple inattention, fatigue. Without memory of the seconds before the fall, I cannot choose confidently. It is possible I was not even unconscious for very long. Maybe I fell, hit my head, became dazed, and only later formed a stable memory while sitting on the grass. From my perspective, it feels like riding. Then, wake up. But the missing section could include several minutes of confused activity. I may have moved the bike, tried to stand, sat back down. None of it was stored properly. That could explain why the transition feels so abrupt. I sometimes wonder whether anyone saw me. A car may have passed. A person might have looked out a window. Maybe someone even stopped and asked if I was okay. I remember none of that. The neighborhood was quiet enough that it is also possible no one saw anything. A teenage kid could fall off a bike in the dark, lie there briefly, then get up and continue home without anyone knowing. The idea that there might be missing interactions I will never remember is unsettling. But again, concussion makes that much more believable than anything paranormal. What I do not think happened is that I vanished into some alternate reality and returned. The family forgetting can make the story sound that way. One version of reality contains bike crash. Doctor, 2 days sick. Another version contains no crash, no family memory. It is easy to turn that into a parallel universe story. But there is no evidence that reality changed. There are much simpler explanations. My family forgot. My memory combined events. The timeline shifted. Some details came from what I was told later. Those are all ordinary ways memory can create disagreement. And after roughly 4 decades, disagreement is not surprising. Still, emotionally, it is difficult. We trust family members as witnesses to our own childhood. A lot of our memories are reinforced by them. Remember when we went there? Remember when Dad did that? Remember when you broke your arm? The family becomes a kind of shared archive. So when you bring up something important and every person in that archive says, no, nothing, it creates a strange feeling. Almost like somebody removed a page. I think that is what bothered me most when I recently told the story. The original event had always been stable in my mind because I never had a reason to question it. Then suddenly 7 other people gave me no support at all. That forces you to look inward. How much do I trust this? Where did the memory come from? Could I really have created an entire medical event? I do not think I did. I still believe the basic accident happened. There is nothing implausible about it. Teenagers fall off bicycles. Concussions happen. Families forget things. That is a much stronger explanation than anything supernatural. But I also have to admit that I cannot independently prove it anymore. If there were medical records somewhere, they could settle part of it. An old hospital bill, a doctor's note, insurance record, maybe even a school absence. But after so many years, I have no idea whether anything like that still exists. Without documentation, all I have is memory, and memory is exactly what is in dispute. I find the missing time from the night more interesting now than I did when I was young. At the time, I accepted, I hit my head, so I don't remember. That is probably correct. But when your family later denies the aftermath, the blank section starts feeling larger. What happened between leaving my friend's house and getting home? How long was I on that grass? Did I definitely crash at that curb? Was the bike damaged? Did I have cuts? Was there blood? I cannot answer most of those questions now. The story has a very clear beginning and a clear awakening. The middle is absent. That absence invites imagination. Maybe that is why I keep thinking about it. If I remembered the front wheel catching the curb, my body flying sideways, and my head hitting the ground, there would be no mystery. If my family remembered taking me to the doctor, same. Instead, both points where confirmation should exist are missing. I do not remember the crash. They do not remember the aftermath. That creates a strange empty space around the entire event. But an empty space is not evidence of something impossible. Sometimes it is simply what 40-year-old memories look like. I also wonder how much of the family reaction was really, "This never happened," versus, "We don't remember this." Those are very different statements. Not remembering something does not mean it did not occur. If I ask 5 siblings to remember what I did on one summer night in the 80s, the normal answer should probably be no idea. The medical part feels more significant, but even that could disappear. Families often remember major injuries and forget moderate ones. A mild concussion that resolved after a couple of days may not have become part of the family mythology. For me, vomiting in bed for 2 days was miserable. For a sibling, maybe it was just a weekend when I stayed in my room. They had their own lives, their own friends, their own problems. They were not watching me continuously. My parents may also have remembered the event at one time and lost it later. Memory is not permanent simply because something mattered. That is uncomfortable but ordinary. I think the most reasonable reconstruction is still the simple one. I was riding home late. I was probably tired. Something caused me to lose control of the bicycle. I struck the curb or road and hit my head. The impact disrupted my memory of the crash. I regained awareness on the grass. I managed to get home. The next day, I received medical attention and was told I had a concussion. I recovered over the next couple of days. Then, life continued. 40 years passed. My family forgot. Some of my own details blurred. Nothing supernatural required. That explanation makes sense. Yet it does not completely remove the eerie feeling I had when I realized nobody remembered. Because the memory does not feel like a story someone told me. It feels like mine. I can still imagine the darkness, the bike, the grass, that horrible headache, the physical misery afterward. And there is something unsettling about having a memory that belongs only to you when 7 other people seem like they should share at least some part of it. It makes you understand how isolated memory really is. Even within a family, everyone carries a different version of the past. Most of the time, those versions overlap enough that we never notice. Then occasionally, you tell a story everyone should know, and the room goes quiet. No one remembers. Suddenly, your own past feels less solid. That is what happened to me. The bike accident itself does not scare me much anymore. If anything, I was lucky. A teenage kid crashing at 10 speed alone at night could have ended much worse. What stays with me is the gap. One moment I was riding through quiet Michigan streets, listening to the soft clicking of the bike. Then I was on the grass beside the curb with no memory of getting there. For most of my life, I thought the missing part was only the crash. Now, after talking to my family, it feels like the missing part somehow extends beyond me. Because according to the 7 people who should have seen what happened next, there was apparently no concussion, no doctor, no 2 days in bed, no vomiting, no accident worth remembering. Maybe that is all this is, a teenager's concussion and a family's forgotten weekend. I think that is probably the truth. But I still find it deeply strange that I can remember waking beside that bicycle so clearly, while everyone else remembers a version of those years where, as far as they know, I never fell at all. While I was completing my master's degree, I worked for a ghost tour company. It was actually one of the more enjoyable jobs I had during that period of my life. Most evenings involved walking groups through the historic parts of the city, wearing a slightly ridiculous costume, stopping in front of old buildings, and telling stories about murders, strange deaths, local legends, and supposed hauntings. I had worked with children for years and had spent a lot of time reading aloud to them, so I had developed what people sometimes call a storyteller's voice. That helped. If you are leading people around a city at night telling ghost stories, delivery matters almost as much as the story itself. You need to know when to pause, when to lower your voice, when to let people look at the building behind you before revealing the disturbing part. Apparently, I was pretty good at it because I usually did well with tips. I met all kinds of people, believers, skeptics, tourists, who just wanted something fun to do. People who arrived carrying ghost hunting equipment and were already convinced they were going to find something. Others spent the whole tour making jokes. I always tried to give everyone the same experience. Tell the history. Tell the legend. Let people decide for themselves. The funny thing was that despite spending so many nights standing in front of supposedly haunted buildings, I never really saw anything. I wanted to sometimes. Not enough that I was going to invent something, but there were definitely evenings where I thought it would be incredible if something actually happened. Nothing did, at least not to me visually. Other people on my tours, however, claimed to see things. That by itself was not especially surprising. When you bring 15 people on a ghost tour and spend 90 minutes telling them creepy stories in the dark, somebody is probably going to see a shadow and think it is a person. What made it interesting was that guests tended to report the same few things. Not once, repeatedly, over years. And usually it would not be the whole group. Maybe 2 people. 3 at most. The rest would look exactly where they were pointing and see absolutely nothing. That happened often enough that I started recognizing the pattern. One of the first places on the tour was an old building where I would stop to tell my opening story. I had a particular spot where I usually stood. Near me was a window. The building itself would normally be empty by the time our evening tours began. That was useful because it gave us a quiet backdrop. No employees moving around, no customers staring out at the tourists. At least that was how it was supposed to be. Every now and then, while I was telling the story, someone in the group would look past me toward the window. Sometimes they would keep watching it for a while. Then, either during the story or afterward, they would ask me, "Who's the woman in the window?" The first time somebody asked, I probably assumed there really was someone inside. Maybe an employee had stayed late. Maybe a cleaner. Maybe the building was not as empty as I had been told. So I looked. Nothing. The guest would point. She was right there. What made their descriptions strange was that some of them said the woman did not seem like a random person inside the building. They said she appeared to be watching me, listening to the story. Some even got the impression that she knew me. I never saw her. Not once. And it was not the same guest returning and repeating the story. Different tours, different people, months apart, sometimes longer. Someone would ask about the woman in the window. I would turn. Empty glass. It is easy to see how that could happen naturally. Windows at night are reflective. If the street was lit behind the tour group, the glass might reflect someone standing somewhere else. A woman in the group. A passerby. Someone across the street. Because the reflection would appear inside the window, the guest could interpret it as a person standing in the building. The fact that she seemed to be looking at me could simply come from the geometry of the reflection. If the reflected person was facing my direction, it would appear as though the woman inside was watching the storyteller. That is not difficult to imagine. There may also have been curtains, furniture, or shapes inside that repeatedly created a face-like impression. People are extremely good at finding human figures in partial visual information, especially after sunset, especially on a ghost tour. And because only a few people in each group ever saw her, some kind of viewing angle-dependent reflection makes a lot of sense. 2 people standing beside each other might catch it. Someone 5 feet away might not. The second recurring sighting happened at another old building along the route. By the time I was giving tours, the place had been turned into a trendy coffee shop. During the day, it looked completely harmless. People sitting around drinking coffee in a historic building. But the upper part was much older and stranger. There was a top floor that, as far as I understood, was completely inaccessible. We would pass the building on the tour, and every so often, a guest would look upward and tell me there was someone standing at one of the top windows. Not just standing there either. They described the person as scowling down at them. Again, I would look. Nothing. Other guests would look. Most saw nothing. A few would insist somebody had definitely been there. That one always interested me because of the inaccessible upper floor. If there really was no normal way for someone to be standing at that window, then a literal person becomes less likely. But inaccessible can mean different things. Maybe customers could not access it. That does not necessarily mean nobody ever could. Owners, maintenance workers, storage access, fire stairs, older internal routes. I never personally inspected every part of the building, so I cannot say with certainty that no human being could ever stand there. More likely, though, the window itself probably created the image. Old windows often have uneven glass. Reflections distort. Curtains, beams, stains, plants, or objects placed several feet behind the window can line up into a human face. Because the guest is looking upward from street level, the angle is bad. You see a dark head-like shape and two lighter patches. Your brain finishes the face. Once you decide the expression is a scowl, the entire thing suddenly feels intentional. And again, expectation matters. We were not taking an architecture tour. People had paid to hear ghost stories. That does not mean they were lying. Most probably sincerely saw something that looked like a person. But the context strongly influences interpretation. The third repeated sighting happened at the final stop. That building had the biggest reputation. It was supposed to be one of, if not the most haunted buildings in the city. The tour ended there partly because it was the natural climax. You save your strongest location for last. By that point, the group had spent the evening hearing stories. It was dark. People were fully in the atmosphere. One part of the final story involved pointing toward the bedroom window of the building's famous former owner. According to the story, he had died in that bedroom. The bed he had died in was apparently still kept there. I would point toward that window while explaining the history. Every so often, someone in the group would interrupt or mention something afterward. They said they could see little lights moving on the other side of the glass. The descriptions were usually similar. They looked like fireflies, small points of light drifting around inside the bedroom. Again, only a few people would see them. Others standing right beside them would see nothing. I never saw the lights myself. There are many possible explanations for that one. Reflections from passing cars, streetlights, phones in the group, small insects near the window catching light, reflections from water or polished glass. Even slight movements of the observers themselves can make reflected points appear to drift. If the window had old glass, imperfections could turn one source into several moving highlights. The fact that people described them as fireflies may simply mean they were tiny, bright, moving points. And because the bedroom already had a death story attached to it, those points became mysterious instead of ordinary reflections. Still, after hearing similar descriptions from different people, I paid attention whenever we stopped there. Nothing. The room always looked dark to me. I sometimes wondered whether I was simply standing in the wrong place. As the guide, I had a consistent position. The guests were spread around in front of me. Maybe some of them occupied the exact angles necessary to catch reflections that I could not. That would actually explain why I never saw the recurring phenomena, even after dozens of tours. My position was fixed. Theirs changed. It is a very ordinary explanation. But it is also funny. I spent years telling people ghost stories and apparently had the worst seat in the group for seeing the ghosts. Eventually, I reached the end of my time as a permanent employee. I was finishing that stage of my life and was going to stop doing regular tours. I knew I might return occasionally during the Halloween season, when they needed extra guides, but this was basically my final night as part of the normal staff. We reached the supposedly haunted house at the end of the tour. The entrance had several stone steps leading up to a large wooden front door. I gave the final story. Then I told the group that this was my last regular tour. I thanked them for being such a good audience. It felt like a nice ending. I had spent a lot of evenings standing in that doorway. Now I was saying goodbye to the job. When I finished speaking, I started to step away, and something grabbed the back of my collar. That is exactly what it felt like. Not a gentle pull, not fabric slowly catching on something, a sharp, strong tug backward. It happened so suddenly that my balance went completely. For a second, I thought I was going to fall backward or sideways down the stone steps. One of the guests reacted quickly enough to help catch me. If they had not, I might have gone down hard. I recovered and immediately turned around. Nothing was there. My first thought was that my costume had caught on the door. That would be the obvious explanation. As part of the tour outfit, I wore a cape. Capes are basically designed to get caught on things. Door hardware, decorations, rough wood, anything sticking out. If the cape snagged while I stepped forward, the fabric could pull against the back of my neck. People I told the story to later gave me exactly that explanation. You caught the cape on the door. And yes, it is absolutely possible. It may even be the most likely explanation. But the reason the incident stayed with me is that it did not feel like fabric tension spreading across the cape. The pressure felt concentrated right at my collar, like a hand had closed around the back of it. Then, one hard pull. The force also felt stronger than I expected from the speed I was moving. I was not running. I was simply taking a step away from the doorway. If fabric caught gently, I would expect to feel resistance building. Instead, this felt immediate. Grab, yank, balance, gone. That is my memory of it. But perception during a sudden loss of balance is not perfect. If the cape snagged on a protruding piece of the door or frame, the force could absolutely be concentrated at the collar, because that was where the cape attached to me. The fabric might have had slack. I step forward. Slack disappears. Sudden stop. My body keeps moving. The collar takes all the force at once. That could feel exactly like someone grabbing me. In fact, mechanically, that explanation is very strong. The surprise would make the sensation seem even more intentional. When something physically pulls your clothing from behind, your brain immediately interprets it as a hand, because hands are normally what pull clothes. You do not consciously calculate fabric tension. You think, someone grabbed me. There is also the question of whether the cape was actually caught when I looked. I do not remember finding it hooked onto anything obvious. That is part of why I remained unsettled. But a snag does not have to remain snagged. The fabric could catch on a rough edge, pull hard, then slip free as my body jerked. By the time I turned around, there would be nothing to see. A decorative piece, splinter, door latch, nail, any of those could do it. And because I almost fell, I was probably more focused on regaining my balance than inspecting the exact contact point. The guest catching me also confirms that something physically happened. I did not simply imagine being pulled while standing perfectly still. My body moved enough for another person to react. But that does not tell us the source. Cape snagging would produce exactly the same visible result as a hand tugging me. I sometimes wonder whether the emotional context amplified the experience. I had just told the building goodbye. Not literally, perhaps, but I had announced that this was my last tour as a permanent guide. Then, immediately, something seemed to pull me backward into the doorway. It creates a perfect story. The haunted house did not want me to leave. That interpretation almost writes itself. If the exact same snag had happened 6 months earlier in the middle of a random tour, maybe I would have cursed the cape, adjusted it, and forgotten the entire incident. Because it happened after saying, "This is my last regular tour," the timing made it feel like a response. That is worth recognizing. Coincidences become meaningful when they land on emotionally important moments, and this one landed perfectly. The building had spent years being the final destination of my ghost stories. Then, on my last night, something yanked me backward as I tried to leave. If you wanted to construct a haunted house legend, you could not write the scene much better. But good timing does not prove intention. The doorway was also somewhere I had stood many times in the same costume. Maybe the cape had brushed that doorframe dozens of times before. On the final night, it happened to catch. That is probably the explanation. Still, after that, I changed my behavior. When I came back for Halloween tours over the next few years, I would still take groups to the house. I still told the story. I still pointed out the window. But I stopped standing in that doorway. I could tell myself it had only been the cape. I mostly believed that. I still did not feel like testing it. That is the difference between intellectual explanation and physical memory. My brain could say, fabric caught. My body remembered being violently pulled backward toward stone steps. There was no reason I needed to stand in the exact same spot. So, I did not. Looking back on the years I spent doing those tours, the interesting thing is that I never became a firm believer because of any of it. If anything, working the job made me more aware of how strange perception can be. 15 people can look at the same window. 2 see a woman. 13 see nothing. Another night, 3 people see tiny lights inside a room. Everyone else sees dark glass. A guest looks at an upstairs window and sees someone scowling. The person next to them sees an empty building. Those differences are interesting, but they do not automatically support ghosts. They may tell us more about viewing angles, reflections, expectation, and perception. Night tours are almost perfect environments for that. Low light, old architecture, uneven glass, streetlights, moving cars, trees, historic stories, people actively searching windows after being told someone died there. Under those conditions, the brain is going to find things. And yet the repeated similarities still make me pause. Why a woman at that same first window? Why a person at the inaccessible top floor? Why little moving lights in the same dead man's bedroom? If every guest reported something completely different, I would dismiss it more easily. One sees a dog, another sees a child, someone sees a blue orb, someone sees nothing. Instead, certain places seem to produce certain kinds of reports. That could mean the physical environment produced repeatable illusions. Actually, I think that is probably the strongest skeptical explanation. Same window, same reflection, same architecture. Different people stand in roughly similar places, therefore similar visual effects. The repetition does not necessarily support a haunting. It may support a stable optical setup. A woman-like reflection appears from certain angles because the same streetlight and interior objects are always there. A dark patch upstairs consistently resembles a scowling face. Small reflections in the bedroom window consistently move like fireflies. That would be exactly what we should expect if the buildings themselves created the illusions. And because only a minority of people in each group occupied the right angles, Only those people saw them. That fits remarkably well. The alternative supernatural explanation is also simple. Some people can see the spirits, others cannot. But that explanation is impossible to test from the tour alone. Any person who sees nothing can be classified as unable to see them. Any person who sees something becomes evidence. There is no outcome that disproves it. That makes me cautious. The collar incident is different because it happened to me physically. No window, no distant reflection. Something pulled. But again, I was wearing a cape in a wooden doorway. There is an obvious mechanism available. The fact that it felt like a hand does not eliminate that mechanism. A sudden fabric snag at the neck would probably feel exactly like a hand. I have never been comfortable claiming otherwise. What I can say is that I had worn that costume many times. I had stood in that doorway many times. Nothing like that had happened before. Then, on the exact night I announced I was leaving, something caught or pulled me hard enough that a guest had to help stop me from falling down the steps. That is a fact of the experience. The meaning is uncertain. Maybe the door caught my cape. Maybe I shifted my weight badly. Maybe I stepped backward unexpectedly. Maybe there was a loose piece of fabric I did not notice. All ordinary. And if someone told me the story, I would probably tell them the same thing everyone told me. Your cape got caught. But I would also understand why they never stood in the doorway again. Because there is a difference between hearing an explanation and feeling that sharp pull against the back of your neck. The whole job was like that. The historical facts were easy. Names, dates, buildings, deaths. Those could be researched. The ghost stories existed in a different category. Some were obviously embellished over decades. Others may have begun with a real strange event. Guests added their own experiences. Guides repeated them. The city slowly developed layers of folklore. I was part of that process, whether I meant to be or not. A guest sees a woman in the window, tells me. Later, another guest says the same thing. Now I remember the first report. Maybe I mention afterward that people sometimes see a woman there. Now future groups know to look. That changes everything. I tried not to prime people too much, but even the basic ghost story is already priming. You cannot tell someone, a woman supposedly haunts this building, then treat their later report of a woman as completely independent. That is why the sightings that happened before any specific description were more interesting. But after years, it becomes difficult to know exactly who knew what. The stories feed the sightings. The sightings feed the stories. Eventually, the line between folklore and observation becomes almost impossible to separate. My own collar story probably became part of that too. I told coworkers. Maybe they told others. Maybe future guides stood near that doorway, knowing the building had supposedly grabbed one of us on his last night. If one of them later felt a tug, the story would reinforce itself. That is how haunted places grow. Not necessarily because people are dishonest. Most are sincere. But memory, expectation, architecture, coincidence, and storytelling all work together. And storytelling was literally my job. That may be why I remain skeptical despite loving the experience. I know how powerful a well-told story can be. You can stand 15 people in front of an ordinary dark window and describe a death that happened behind it a century earlier. Before the story, it is glass. After the story, everyone is watching the glass differently. Every reflection matters. Every flicker. Every movement behind curtains. The building has not changed. Attention has. That does not mean nobody ever sees something genuinely unexplained. It means you need stronger evidence than a frightening impression. I never got that evidence. No photograph of the woman, no video of the person upstairs, no recording clearly showing the little lights moving inside the bedroom, no camera showing an invisible hand pulling my collar. So I leave the experiences unresolved rather than calling them proof. But I also do not dismiss the guests. They saw what they saw. Sometimes 2 or 3 people would react at nearly the same moment without the others seeing anything. That is genuinely interesting. Maybe they shared a viewing angle. Maybe one person reacted first and the others followed. Maybe reflections lined up. Maybe something else happened. I do not know. What I remember most fondly is that the job was fun. I was earning money while finishing my degree. I got to walk through historic streets, tell stories, meet new people every night. And occasionally something happened that made even the guide question the story he had just been telling. My final regular tour gave me exactly one of those moments. I finished at the city's supposedly most haunted house. I stood by the old wooden doorway above those stone steps. I thanked everyone, told them it was my final night as a permanent staff member. Then I moved to step away. Something caught the back of my collar and yanked so sharply that my body went backward instead. A guest grabbed me before I went down the steps. I turned around. Nothing. No person. No hand. No obvious explanation waiting behind me. Maybe the cape caught. That is still what I think probably happened. But I had spent years telling people that strange things happened at that house. Then, on the night I finally tried to leave it behind, it seemed to grab me by the neck. After that, whenever I returned during Halloween season, I still told the story. I still took groups to the same building. I still stood close enough to point out the dead man's bedroom. But I never stood in that doorway again. I had already spent enough nights explaining away other people's ghosts. I did not feel any need to give that doorway a second chance to explain mine. Whenever I get a fever, my brain seems to do strange things. Even now, if I am sick enough, my dreams can become much more vivid than normal. But the strangest fever experience I ever had happened when I was around 7 or 8 years old. I had been sick all day. I do not remember exactly how high my temperature was, only that my mom knew I was unwell and eventually told me I needed to go to bed. I did not want to. There was something on television I wanted to finish watching, probably an episode of some show I was really into at the time, and I remember arguing with her in that very specific way sick children do. I'm not tired. I want to watch this. I'll go to bed later. Of course, my mom won. Eventually, I went to my room. I remember sitting down on the bed, and almost immediately, something felt wrong. I suddenly felt small, not emotionally small, physically small, extremely small. It was as though my body had shrunk while the room had become enormous around me. The bed seemed too large. The space around me felt wrong. My hands and body did not seem to have their normal proportions. I remember being disturbed by it, but I also knew I had a fever. Even at 7 or 8, I understood that being sick could make you feel weird. So my reaction was basically, okay, the fever is messing with me. I called for my mom. She came into the room. I asked her to help me with something, although I cannot remember exactly what it was now. Maybe I needed water. Maybe I was uncomfortable. Maybe I just wanted her there because the room felt so strange. She helped me. Nothing frightening happened while she was there. Then I went to sleep. Or at least, that is what I thought happened. The next thing I remember is waking up maybe 1 or 2 hours later. I felt completely awake, not groggy, not sick in the dreamlike way I had felt before. I got out of bed and went to find my mom. I remember walking up to her and asking for breakfast. She looked at me like I had said something completely ridiculous. Breakfast? I did not understand her confusion. Yes, in my mind it was morning. I had gone to bed sick, slept, woken up, and now it was obviously the next day. I was not tired anymore. That seemed like proof. But my mom told me it was around 10 at night. I remember being genuinely confused. That did not make any sense. I told her it was morning. She said no. I had only gone to bed a few hours earlier. It was still the same night. She told me to go back to sleep. I did not want to. I felt wide awake. But eventually, I went back to my room anyway. I remember deciding that if I could not sleep, I would read. I think I was reading Harry Potter at the time. So I picked up the book and started reading. I remember turning pages, following the story, spending what felt like a long time awake in my room. The rest of the house was quiet because it was nighttime. I remember having the impression that everyone else was sleeping while I was just lying there reading because my body had completely lost its sense of time. As far as I was concerned, I stayed awake for the rest of the night. I do not remember falling asleep again. That is important. There was no clear moment where my eyes became heavy and I put the book down. No obvious transition into another dream. I simply remember being awake, reading, and then somehow, the next thing I knew, it was morning. I woke up in bed. That was immediately confusing. Because from my point of view, I had already been awake. I had spent the night reading. How had I gone from sitting there with Harry Potter to waking up in bed? I went to my mom and asked what had happened during the night. Her answer made everything much stranger. According to her, nothing had happened. She said I had gone to sleep at around 7 in the evening, and I had slept through the entire night. I thought she misunderstood me. I reminded her that I had gotten up. I had gone to her. I had asked for breakfast at 10 at night. She had told me it was not morning. She had sent me back to bed. Then I had spent the night reading. She had no idea what I was talking about. My dad said the same thing. As far as both of them knew, I had gone to bed sick and stayed there until morning. I had not come out asking for breakfast. I had not been wandering around the house. I had not been awake reading all night. Nothing. That was when I started realizing that the whole experience must have happened inside a dream, or maybe several dreams. I had dreamed that I woke up. Then inside that dream, I believed I had stayed awake. Then I woke up for real. Basically, I had a dream inside another dream, or at least a series of false awakenings that felt completely continuous. That explanation made sense. But it still did not feel right because of how normal everything had seemed. Most dreams have something wrong with them. A room changes shape. A person looks different. You suddenly appear somewhere else. Time skips. Even if you do not notice while dreaming, afterward you can usually point to something and say, obviously that was a dream. This was different. The house looked right. My mom acted like my mom. The time on the clock apparently made sense. I had a conversation. I went back to my room. I read a real book I was actually reading at that age. Nothing about it announced itself as a dream. It felt like a normal night. And then later that day, something happened that made it even stranger. I picked up Harry Potter again to continue reading. I started going through the pages. And suddenly, I had this incredibly strong feeling. I had already read this. Not, I vaguely remember this part. Not, maybe I read ahead earlier. I genuinely felt like I knew the section because I had read it during the night. The night my parents said I had been asleep. I remember thinking, what the hell? At 7 or 8 years old, I did not have a good explanation for that. If I had dreamed the entire night, how had I apparently read part of a real book accurately enough that the pages felt familiar the next day? That was the part that stuck with me. The false awakening itself was strange. The Harry Potter feeling made it seem impossible. For a while, I wondered whether I had actually been awake and my parents simply had not noticed. Maybe I got up at 10, spoke to Mom while she was half asleep, went back to the bedroom, read for hours, then eventually fell asleep without remembering it. The next morning, she forgot the conversation. Dad never knew. That would explain almost everything. Parents do not necessarily monitor a sleeping child every second. Maybe Mom genuinely forgot a short interaction. If she was tired, she could have answered me without forming a strong memory. Maybe I really did read. Then, sometime before morning, I put the book down and fell asleep. My memory skipped that transition. That is possible. But according to my parents, they were very certain. They said I slept through the night. That does not prove they watched me continuously, but it made the experience harder to dismiss. There is also the fever. That is probably the biggest clue. Fevers can make sleep extremely strange. Dreams can become intense. People can wake confused about where they are. Time can feel distorted. Children especially can become disoriented when sick. I am not trying to diagnose exactly what happened to me from one childhood memory, but a fever gives the brain plenty of reason to produce unusual experiences without needing anything paranormal. The feeling of being tiny may have been part of that. There are experiences where body size and room size feel distorted. A person's hands might feel huge. Their body might feel miniature. The room can seem too far away or strangely close. It can happen around sleep, migraines, fever, or other altered states. I did not know any of that as a child. I only knew that I sat on my bed and suddenly felt extremely small. That may have been the first sign that my perception was already becoming unreliable before I fell asleep. Then, the dream simply continued using the real house around me. One possibility is that my mom really did come into the room before I fell asleep. That part may be a real memory. I called her. She came in. She helped me. Then, I fell asleep. Everything after that was dream material built from the last real environment I remembered. My brain already knew what the bedroom looked like. It knew where Mom would be. It knew I wanted morning to arrive because I felt sick and did not want to sleep. So it created a convincing false awakening. I woke, went to Mom, asked for breakfast. She told me it was 10 at night. That detail sounds unusually specific for a dream, but dreams can contain clocks and conversations. Maybe 10 p.m. was a real time I had seen before sleeping. Maybe I overheard someone say it. Maybe my brain invented it. The important thing is that inside the dream, I accepted it. I went back to my room. Then the next layer began. I read Harry Potter. Perhaps I eventually dreamed that I never fell asleep. That is an especially strange kind of dream because it can make the night seem continuous. You wake the next morning, convinced you were awake for hours. In reality, your body was sleeping the entire time. The brain creates the memory of wakefulness. That could explain why there was no moment where I fell asleep again. There never was a second waking period. I was dreaming that I was awake. Then morning arrived, and I actually woke. The Harry Potter déjà vu still needs an explanation, though one simple possibility is that I had already read those pages earlier and forgotten. Maybe I had read them before getting sick. Then, during the fever dream, my brain recreated some of that material. The next day, when I encountered the same section, I read this last night. But the real source of familiarity was an earlier reading. Memory can mislabel its source. You know something is familiar, but not why. The brain supplies the most recent explanation. In my case, I remember reading last night. So this must be what I read. That would make the experience feel much more precise than it actually was. Maybe I did not remember exact sentences. Maybe I simply knew what scene came next. If I had already read ahead once or skimmed those pages, the familiarity could be genuine. The timing attribution could be wrong. Another possibility is that the dream itself used material from the book I had already seen. Dreams are not good at generating long, accurate text. If you try to read complicated writing in a dream, it often changes or becomes unstable. But a dream does not need to reproduce the actual printed pages for me to remember reading Harry Potter. It could create the impression of reading. Maybe I saw a page like shapes and experienced the story in my head. Then the next day, because I expected those pages to correspond to the dream, ordinary familiarity felt like confirmation. That is probably more likely than my sleeping brain somehow reading a physical book with my eyes closed. There is also the possibility I woke briefly and really did read. Sleep is not always one uninterrupted block. People wake during the night and sometimes remember none of it. I might have physically sat up, picked up the book, read a little, then fallen asleep again. My parents could still honestly believe I slept through the night because they never checked at that exact moment. In that case, the 10 p.m. breakfast conversation may have been a dream, while the reading was partly real. That would produce a blended memory. Real, sleep, dream awakening. Brief, real awakening. Reading, sleep again. Then real morning. Years later, the boundaries disappear and it becomes one continuous night. That explanation actually seems very plausible to me. We tend to think an event was either completely dreamed or completely real. But sleep experiences can mix the two. A real sound enters a dream. You wake for 30 seconds, fall asleep. Dream that you stayed awake. Wake again. The brain stitches everything together. The result feels like one timeline, even though consciousness was switching states. The fact that I had a fever would make those transitions even messier. Maybe my mother did come into the room more than once. Maybe I actually spoke to her, but she forgot. Maybe I dreamed the conversation. I cannot separate those possibilities now. I was 7 or 8. I did not write anything down. All I have is the memory that survived. The sense of being small is especially interesting because it happened before the complicated night. I remember thinking clearly, the fever is messing with me. That suggests I was aware enough to recognize an altered sensation while still awake. Maybe I was already drifting in and out of sleep while sitting on the bed. Children with fever can fall asleep quickly without realizing it. Perhaps the moment I sat down, I began dreaming. The mom who came into my room may even have been part of the dream. If so, the dream began earlier than I think. That is where the entire story becomes difficult to anchor. What is the last part I know happened physically? Watching television? Mom telling me to go to bed? Walking into the bedroom? Sitting down? Calling her? I cannot prove where waking life ended. That is probably why false awakenings are so convincing. The transition is hidden. There is no obvious cut. You think you woke up because the dream includes waking. You recognize the room. You remember your previous thoughts. The story continues smoothly. Only later does something contradict it. For me, the contradiction was morning. I should not have been waking in bed because I remembered staying awake. Then my parents gave me a second contradiction. According to them, the nighttime version of me had never come out of the bedroom at all. That made the whole thing feel like reality had split. As a child, I probably wondered whether there had somehow been two nights. One I experienced, one my parents experienced. That kind of thought is easy when you do not understand how vivid dreams can be. The morning déjà vu made it worse, because now there seemed to be physical evidence from the dream. The book. I had already read those pages. But déjà vu itself can be incredibly strong. Sometimes you enter a room for the first time and feel absolutely certain you have been there before. Sometimes a conversation feels repeated. The feeling of familiarity does not always come with an accurate source. My book experience may have been something like that. The fever dream created a memory of reading. The next day, ordinary familiarity with the book attached itself to that memory. Suddenly, proof. But the proof existed only as a feeling. I did not find a bookmark moved 20 pages ahead. I did not discover notes I had written during the night. I did not tell my mom the exact next paragraph before reading it. I only recognized the material. That is important. If the physical bookmark had moved while my parents swore I never woke, that would be more interesting. If I could quote pages I had never previously seen, same, but I do not remember anything like that. So there is no strong evidence that I actually read while asleep. There is only familiarity. And familiarity is one of the easiest things for memory to misinterpret. The fact that I continued reading normally afterward suggests the experience did not repeat once the fever passed. I did not start regularly waking into alternate nights. I did not begin reading books in my sleep. Nothing followed me. It was one bizarre sick night experience. That also points toward fever and sleep disruption. A paranormal explanation would have to explain why it happened during an illness and then disappeared when I recovered. The illness already gives us a perfectly good reason for the brain to behave unusually. I also think the time confusion is revealing. In the dream, I woke at 10 p.m. and was absolutely convinced it was morning. That kind of certainty, despite obvious contradiction, is very dreamlike. If I were fully awake, I might look outside, notice darkness, check a clock, realize quickly. But in the experience, Mom told me it was 10, and I basically accepted both things at once. It is morning. Mom says it is 10 at night. Dreams allow contradictions without forcing resolution. You can know two incompatible facts and simply continue. That is probably what happened. The same is true of feeling completely rested after only 1 or 2 hours. Inside the dream, it seemed natural. My body said morning. So I believed morning. The mind created the state along with the environment. I find the small feeling almost creepier now than the dream inside the dream. There is something deeply unsettling about suddenly feeling like your body has changed size while everything around you remains familiar. I remember sitting on the bed and knowing something was off. But because I was already feverish, I did not panic. I had an explanation ready. Sick brain. And I was probably right. Maybe the whole night should be understood that way. Not as one impossible event, just a feverish brain repeatedly failing to separate internal experience from external reality. The room size distortion. The false morning. The conversation that may never have occurred. The long reading session that may have lasted only minutes inside a dream. Then, the déjà vu the next day. All parts of one disrupted night. That explanation is much less dramatic than a parallel timeline, but it fits. What I find interesting is how confident memory can remain despite evidence against it. Even after both parents told me I slept through the night, part of me still thought, no, I remember being awake. That is one of the strangest things about dreams. A normal dream often loses reality the moment you wake. You think that was weird, This one remained attached to autobiographical memory. It felt like something I had done, not something I had dreamed. I remembered walking, talking, reading, deciding not to sleep. Those are actions. The brain stored them with the same emotional texture as waking memories. So when my parents contradicted me, it felt like they were denying something that had happened. They were probably not. They were probably describing the real night. I was describing the night my sleeping brain created. Both existed in memory, but only one happened outside my head. I think that is the most likely explanation. Maybe there were brief, real awakenings mixed in. Maybe Mom actually came to the room once. Maybe I genuinely read a few pages. But the larger sequence was almost certainly dream-based. And the fever was probably what made it so intense. If anything similar happened to me now, I would probably recognize it much faster. If I woke after being asleep for 2 hours and felt certain it was morning, I would check my phone. If I thought I had spent a whole night reading, I could check reading history or page position. Modern life gives us timestamps everywhere. Back then, I had none of that. The experience was allowed to remain uncertain. Maybe that is why it stayed memorable. There was no objective record to settle it. Only Mom, Dad, and me. 2 versions against 1. They remembered a sick child going to bed around 7 and sleeping until morning. I remembered waking later, asking for breakfast at 10 at night, being sent back to my room, reading Harry Potter while everyone slept, and somehow waking again after a night during which I believed I had never fallen asleep. Years later, I think they were probably right. But I still remember that false night with disturbing clarity, especially the next day. Opening Harry Potter, reading a section, and getting that sudden certainty that I already knew it. For a few seconds, it felt like the dream had left something behind. Not a scratch, not an object, just knowledge. Something from the night my parents insisted I had slept through. I can explain it now with fever, false awakenings, dream memory blending, and déjà vu. Those explanations make sense. I believe them, but I still understand why 7-year-old me was completely confused. Because from my perspective, I did not dream that I woke up. I woke up. I did not dream that I talked to my mother. I remembered talking to her. I did not dream about reading Harry Potter. I remembered spending hours doing it. Then morning arrived. My parents told me none of it had happened. And the book itself seemed familiar anyway. That was the night I first learned something I have never completely forgotten. Sometimes waking up is not enough to prove you were ever awake.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.